Greetings to all of you. My name is Sarath Davala. I am the coordinator of India Network for Basic Income. I have with me Professor Guy Standing, who has been working on basic income for probably more than 30 years. Guy is in Delhi to attend and give the keynote address in the national conference of on basic income. Uh, Guy, I what do you how do you look at the global economy in the next 10 to 15 years? How is it going to unfold?
Well, I think what's happening is that we've reached a state of globalization when the 20th century income distribution system has broken down. And what this means, very briefly, is that the way economic growth is taking place is that more and more of the income is going to the very top, is going to what I call rentiers, and the growing precariat, long way below, is finding life increasingly insecure, with lower wages in real terms, more volatile incomes, and we're creating a situation where insecurity is becoming the defining feature of our age. And in that context, with more flexible labor relations, more informalization, and so on, we have a situation where millions and millions of people all over the world, in every type of country, at every level of development, are being left in insecurity and declining living standards. And this is unsustainable economically and politically. And at the moment, we've reached a crisis where policymakers have to open up old questions and come forward with 21st century answers to 21st century problems, and not go backwards and sort of revisit old policies that are outdated.
How do you apply the concepts like the precariat and universal basic income to countries like Cambodia, India, Chile, or Namibia?
Well, I think that the combination of circumstances in all of those countries, you've still got a rural, informal mass of people whose level of incomes are chronically bad and are not participating in the growth process. And in the towns and cities, you've got this emerging precariat who are linked to the wage labour market, but are not gaining real wages, social protection, access to non-wage benefits. So you've got a combination of circumstances. The concept of the precariat does not apply to the rural villages of India or so on, but the concept of the precariat does apply to many urbanizing, modernizing labour markets. So you've got a combination of circumstances, and I think policymakers, when they're thinking about basic income, have to appreciate that it's about addressing these emerging problems as much as a policy for social integration, social solidarity, and a reduction of the chronic inequalities that we've seen arise. I mean, we cannot continue on the current course. And I think that in India, one has to be blunt and say, yes, some of the policies that have been introduced, what I call the bureaucratic Raj of the last 30 years, may have sort of stemmed the growth of inequality, but they've left the structures basically intact, and they haven't helped in the transformation process in giving people rising living standards and growing ability to choose a way of developing themselves and their communities. And that combination of circumstances means that one should look at basic income in a more open way. And I move away from this dialogue of the deaf between those people who defend the old welfare system as if that was perfect, which was never the case, and those who put cash as the ultimate solution to everything. It isn't. We need good public services. We need help for special groups, the disabled, women, frail elderly, and so on. We need those extra policies. But I think we need a change of emphasis to enable people to have access to the money economy, the development economy. And I think basic income has to be seen in that context.
Some of the critics in India are pointing out that universal basic income is a concept much more relevant in richer countries in Europe and not in countries like India or in Africa. And what do you see that? Do you distinguish like that?
I think that's a very simplistic perspective. It's not helpful. I think it's also wrong. So I think really that in a country like India or those other countries that you've mentioned, precisely because the complex welfare system has not been developed as it is in Europe, it's actually institutionally easier to move from a system of chronic subsidies to a system that is actually enabling people to make choices and participate in a developing, modernizing economy. That's a paradox. Of course, the level of the basic income would be different in India than in the United States, of course, okay? And I think that issue leads into the next one about fiscal space, all right? A lot of people do the simplistic exercise of saying, well, if we gave every Indian a basic income of 1,000 rupees a month, the population is 1.4 billion, we'll do a back of the envelope exercise, look, comes to 7, 10% or whatever percentage it might be, we can't afford it. They're ridiculously bad economics. We've got to realize that we're going to be moving in a direction which maybe we raise the level gradually over time according to the capacity of the state to afford it. We've got to realize that as of now, the government at federal level and at state level combined spend easily that percentage on subsidies of various kinds. Now, what an economist should be able to say, and if they can't say what I'm about to say, they shouldn't be economists, is that subsidies encourage inefficiency. Subsidies encourage inequity. The evidence is overwhelming that they're regressive. In other words, they tend to increase inequality rather than reduce it. Even those subsidies that are intended to be for the poor, most of the money goes to the non-poor. Now, we've had 60 years of experience of that in India and equal number of years in every part of the world. The evidence is overwhelming that that is the case. Now, subsidies are distortionary, they are bad. So why is it that we go on and on and on creating the subsidy Raj? Well, of course, it goes with patronage, it goes with political interests, and of course it's been built up over generations. So as we know, there are hundreds of schemes in this country, most of which do not reach the people they claim to be for. They're going to middlemen and bureaucrats and politicians and everything. Everybody knows that. And yet, for some peculiar reason, people continue to put faith in that system. It's daft. It's daft. And I think we have to say, look, although there are always demands for fiscal space, health services, education, so on, we know it's affordable to have a basic income. It's not a question of affordability, it's a question of political priorities. But for heaven's sake, let's move away from subsidies. And in doing so, I think you will find, as our pilots have shown in Madhya Pradesh, that basically having a basic income is transformative. It is a liberating mechanism which improves welfare, health, schooling, nutrition, and so on, which has a positive effect on the demand for public expenditure. If your health is improved, then you don't put so much onus on the health service, so you're lowering costs. If your education system is working better because the children are able to learn, you don't get so much repeat, or you don't get so much wasted money in the school system because the children aren't able to earn. The same with nutrition. If nutrition improves, it has feedback effects. But we also find that the economic effects of a basic income in the communities where we've piloted increase work, increase economic output, lower inequality, more dynamism in the community, more social solidarity. All of these things are growth-oriented. So when people do a back-of-the-envelope cost, they forget the dynamics. Now, during the conference, several people thought that the dynamic effects were worth 2 or 3% of GDP. It's very hard to estimate the full range of effects. But what we can say, without any doubt, and without any fear of contradiction, is that if you had a basic income, it would be growth-oriented. It would stimulate growth, but in a way that would reduce the inequities that are chronic in India as they are elsewhere, and in ways that would emancipate people. And one way we put it is that we say that the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the money value. And that's very important, because that's not just talking about the pure economics, it's also talking about what is really fundamental about a basic income. A basic income is about giving people greater freedom. And I think that demand that any policy should be judged by whether or not it enhances the freedoms of the recipients and their communities and their families. And if it doesn't, then we should not be looking very, very favorably at that policy. With basic income, you do. You give people a greater choice, you give people a sense of being in control of their lives. It's very, very important. And I've heard too many people in Delhi and in establishment circles give too little attention to that. They want to be paternalistic. They know what the poor need, they think. And they're going to deliver what the poor need, they think. The poor are perfectly rational. They're perfectly capable of knowing their own needs and working it out and learning. And I think it's arrogant, verging on conceit, for people to decide what people need rather than let them develop and work out what they need. So that side of it is very important. And a basic income is a matter of social justice in the end. And that's most important.
Guy, some of the suspicion in India about universal basic income comes from the fact that governments are excited, some of the governments are excited about it. Like India's economic survey carried a chapter on this thing, looking at various possibilities of implementing it. Ontario has initiated a study, Finland has started a pilot. So at the same time, economists like you and the philosophers like Philip Harias and several other people are also excited about universal basic income. What do you think? Are they two different starting points, or why are governments and philosophers agreeing on this?
Well, I think there are good reasons to be excited. I don't think being passionately excited about something is a bad. I think it's an important aspect. It doesn't mean we should be rushing around, jumping up and down with excitement.
Is there an agenda that's going to be hijacked by government?
It could be. It could be. But I think there are good reasons for excitement in the sense that it's pretty clear what the major problems of today are, whether it be in India or elsewhere in the world. There are chronic inequality, chronic insecurity, uneven development, the mental strains that come from insecurity, and a concern in the longer term that automation and robots are going to prevent job creation and are going to make this inequality even greater in the longer term. All of these are coming together, and the bottom line is that there must be a fear that if all of those things are allowed to continue, we will get political instability with extremists and very authoritarian, charismatic figures across the world gaining as a result. Now, I don't think anybody should want that, anybody with any sense. By all means, a government should aim for popularity. That's normal. That's normal. But I think the combination of these circumstances means that we have to look at these issues very, very systematically and in a way that was not the case 20 years ago. It's an urgent issue. It's an urgent issue. A basic income is not a panacea. It requires a context. It requires a set of policies to go with it, to make it work. What I detest is people who dismiss it as if any of us who favour it think that it is a panacea. We don't. We see it as one instrument in a package of reforms that are needed. And that, I think, means that we should be all having a conversation about how we move in that direction, whether we move it for specific groups, whether we move it for women only first, for the elderly first, tribal communities first, whether we roll it out in different ways. We have to be very systematic in the way we do it, very objective, look at the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches. I believe that its essential rule should be that whatever approach we do it and phasing it in, we do it by communities, not by a random selection of individuals or by selective people within communities and not others within that community. And there's one very good reason for that. If you give it to one person and the person next door or even the person inside the household you exclude, you set up interpersonal dynamics that are anything but healthy. All of us would feel that way. If you give my relative something and I'm excluded, am I going to be happy? And you lead to tensions, and you lead to the possibility that it wouldn't have the desired effect at all. Whereas if you give it to everybody in a community equally, you induce solidarity, you induce a sense of reciprocity, you induce a sense of pooling.
And
the community effects are very important. We've seen in our pilots, for example, that one community I'm thinking of where everybody in the community, men, women and children, received the basic income with the children's paid to the mother, and after a few months they set up a small fishing cooperative. And that fishing cooperative meant that the combination of people were putting bits of their money in, and they regarded it as a cooperative activity. And by the time the end of the pilot, the diet of that village had changed, so that all households were able to have fish in their diet. Now, this was a communal activity that was induced by the fact that all the community were part of the scheme. And they used part of the proceeds from selling the fish and so on to provide financial assistance for people who suddenly had an accident or an illness, so that they could mobilize money without going to expensive moneylenders. Now, those sort of transformational effects are sustainable, grow, and they alter the whole atmosphere of a local community. Now, you don't get that if you introduce a paternalistic policy or a selective, targeted policy. You only do it if you have, call it universalistic, call it targeting universalism, if you like. Whatever the name we use, it's embracive.
Guy, you have been an advocate of pilots in all these years. I think you've been part of Namibian pilot, Indian pilot, and also several other pilots. Now, what do you think is the relevance and the value of a pilot, and how should, now so many countries are now excited about this, how should they go about these pilots doing the pilot?
Yeah, I'm calling 2017 the year of the pilot, because, as you say, there are pilots going on in Finland, the Netherlands, Canada. I'm advising on a pilot in California. There are pilots taking shape and developing in Kenya and various other places, and Uganda and so on. And you know, I'm in favor of pilots. I think one should recognize that they have advantages for certain things, but not for others. I believe in a basic income as a matter of social justice. Well, you don't disprove that by having a pilot. I believe that a basic income enhances personal freedom. You don't necessarily find out much about that through pilots. But I think also that you do learn about pilots, about the process by which it should be introduced, the lessons of how you roll it out, how it's received, how it's understood, how people learn to handle money or whatever it might be. And I also think that pilots, particularly in India or other countries in similar levels of development, pilots are very useful for establishing demonstration processes. Our pilots in Madhya Pradesh, for example, I think what they've done is they have established, look, if people are given cash, they use that cash rationally, contrary to the prejudices of people who don't know anything about it, who claim if you gave the poor cash, they'll spend it on alcohol and tobacco, you know. Actually, what happens is people spend less on those temptation goods or bads, okay? Because they're more committed and they're developing, and they spend it on other things to improve their lives, or they're working more. Often it's claimed that if you had basic income, people would become lazy. Well, pilots have shown again and again and again that that's wrong. What we've seen here and in Africa and in Latin America is that if you give people a basic income, they work more. And they're more productive when they're working, and they're more tolerant and cooperative when they're working, all of which raises productivity. So it generates growth. Now, pilots are very useful in debunking prejudices. And I wish more people would take notice and read and study the results of pilots before pontificating about basic income. I saw a very prominent American economist visiting Delhi this last week who dismissed basic income like that. The man had never done any single study of the subject in his life. He knows nothing about it, and yet he thinks he is entitled to have a definitive judgment. And because he's got a big name from other work on other subjects in the United States, the newspapers and policymakers take him seriously. Well, the man is an ignoramus when it comes to this sort of thing. Okay, I would be an ignoramus if I started talking about nuclear bombs or something like that, or heart surgery. So I think there must be respect for empirical studies, actual studies, and that leads me to the methodological point. In the last 5 to 6 years, no more, but that period, there's been an overwhelming faith placed in RCT, randomized controlled trials. That means you basically randomize your selection of people who receives the treatment. And you compare it with people randomized, selected, who do not receive the treatment. Okay? And in the original medical trials, you gave someone the treatment, a pill, someone a placebo, a pill that doesn't actually do anything, and someone else nothing. Now, you can learn quite a lot from randomized control trials, but just think about it. If you give somebody in a family, the husband, a pill for a cold, and you give the wife a placebo, in other words, she doesn't get the treatment, and you give the child no treatment, a cold will bounce off all three of them, because just as the husband is improving, he'll get it from the wife who's not getting any treatment, so her cold continues, and then it will bounce back, and so on. Now, it would be crazy, okay? The same with a basic income. If you gave one person in a household the basic income and not the other people, then the number of other people is going to determine how much you get, and the tensions might become great. If you give one household the basic income and the next household the same sort of problem. So to do a randomized control trial would be a possible way to create civil strife. Now, that's obvious to anybody who can reason. But the RCT people spend too much time in the laboratory and not enough time out doing these things. Now, I'm not knocking RCT, I'm just saying put it in its place, okay? Believe this methodology is valuable, but I warn policymakers, I warn the bureaucracies, I warn academics that it's vitally important to respect methodological diversity in the way we evaluate something. You must integrate a political perspective, you must integrate a psychological perspective, you must integrate anthropological perspectives. We found in our pilots, although we did a moderate randomized control trial sort of methodology, and you have control groups and you compare those receiving and those not receiving, that you learn a lot from having a feel for what's happening in the areas. We spend an enormous amount of time in villages finding out what people think, how they would react, and conceptualizing what are the critical things. Something like work. You know, what is work? And I think the tendency of the RCT to look up here and be super clever and not focus down here on the realities is something they should be worried about.
Guy, do you think that universal basic income is still capitalist road to communism?
I think you can position basic income in a wide variety of political strategies or models. Myself, I believe that we must develop sovereign wealth funds as partial means of paying for a basic income, social dividends. I think that system can be depicted as anti-capitalist or pro-capitalist. I think it would alter the nature and the distributional character of capitalism. But I think these old labels are an impediment to rational discourse, and particularly in regard to a progressive discourse. I think the old left have been shooting themselves in being stuck in a vocabulary and a set of images somewhere back in the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, and have given too little attention to personal freedom, too little attention to new forms of work, new forms of working, new forms of relationship that exist in the 21st century, and are in real danger of becoming marginalized in the political discourse because they're not seeing the issues around the precariat, around insecurity, as something that is fundamentally different from the old Soviet era, socialist era of mass industry and so on. And I think they have to transform their way of thinking, the vocabulary and so on. So I don't see it necessarily as a road to one thing or the other. I may have a vision of the sort of good society that I would believe in. Social solidarity, reduction of inequality, conviviality, a society in which all forms of work, women's work, care work, can be respected, etc. That is my perspective. I think a basic income is an integral part of realizing that sort of society. I think anybody who is opposed to giving a basic income should look in the mirror and ask themselves why they are really opposed. And too many people on the left basically seem to think that if you gave people the freedom, they wouldn't support the unions or the party or whatever it might be. I think that is fundamentally immoral as a position. I think if you are a person who says you are a champion of the poor, which anybody on the left tends to say, then you can't possibly be against giving the poor greater resource capacity to make decisions themselves, how they develop themselves and their families and their communities. And unfortunately or fortunately, the reality is that we live in a money economy, and if money is a scarce commodity, the price of money goes up, and that hits the poor and the insecure. So what sort of recipe is that if you deny the centrality of giving people the scarce commodity in which to lower the price of money and enable them to make better economic and social decisions? And I think that old left has to wake up or go home and sleep, because I think they're becoming irrelevant. That doesn't mean that this is a recipe for a right-wing philosophy either. I think it's a very dangerous illusion by a small minority that you could replace the welfare system, the social structures, with just giving a modest basic income. Now, I know no sensible person who, in the community promoting basic income, who thinks that way. But there are a few mavericks out there, some in the United States. But I don't think either the left or the right, politically, who have got any common sense, should imagine that having a basic income is going to necessarily lead to that dystopia. It's ridiculous, okay? If you believe in public services, as I do, then you should be arguing for public services for grounds that we need public services. Don't start opposing basic income because it might enable some people to be anti-public services. They're going to be anti-public services anyhow. What we need to do is say, we need public education. We need a public education system. We need a public health system. Okay? Yes, there should be choices, But you must have the fundamental right to have access to medicine, access to good schooling. And that requires the state to be actively involved. It's the same with care, social care. The role of the state must be defended or critiqued on whether those can deliver and what it is that they can deliver that the private cannot. If the argument comes down on one side or the other, so be it. But don't distort the discussion of basic income by saying that if we had X, it might weaken commitment to Y. Okay, it's like saying if you have an orange, you won't have a lemon. It's really a disingenuous argument. So when I look at the basic income where we are today, it's very interesting that it is drawing more people from corporate executives, from intellectuals in the middle, political people of different political colors. They each may put it in their own agenda, but I think that the dynamics of it will come out. And we must remember, there's a very good argument that I have with a Swiss friend, that a basic income is also an instrument of advancing democracy. It's the next stage in advancing democracy, because it is empowering people to make decisions and therefore empowering them to become citizens. And when people say there's no reciprocity, there is reciprocity. It's induced. A person has a right to basic income, and as a result, that person is empowered to be responsible and to reciprocate. And in that context, all this nonsense about we will only give you something if you've done something first is the wrong way around. That's coercion. That's unfair. But if I give you something as a right, you as a human being will learn that I have a responsibility backwards. There may be one or two, there may be a small number who don't respect that moral principle, but that is the moral principle of the majority, and we should have faith in people. We should trust people. And I think in the end, this sense of trust and empathy and those values are absolutely critical to this debate.
Guy, you sat through these 2 days of conference and you've been part of the organizing committee of this conference. My last question to you is that what was the nature of conversation in India now? You have listened to most important people discussing it 2 days. In which direction you think India Network for Basic Income should take the conversation?
I've been enormously encouraged by this past week, and I was reflecting on how far the debate has come in the last 10 years. For a long time there was a dialogue of the deaf. You either favoured PDS and Narega or you favoured cash transfers, and insults were exchanged, and there was a useless debate. The mood has changed. We now have a conversation. There are still people who take extreme positions. As soon as they retire, the better. But the debate has moved on. The debate has moved in what can you substitute for what path forward. Should we go for more universalistic or more targeting? These issues are to be debated and refined. I think pilots will help, and that's why I really felt the positive atmosphere about the value of pilots is very important at state level, tribal community level, whatever it is. So I think that debate has progressed enormously. I was impressed by the caliber of the speakers. I mean, for heaven's sake, we had some of the best minds in economics who came and spoke. Not all of them are converted. They are some skeptical, particularly the older ones who've been stuck in a model for the whole of their lives. One wouldn't expect that. I think INBI has a great opportunity to be a forum for debate. I think where we've had BIAN, the Basic Income Earth Network, I've always insisted in the past 30 years that we have a broad church approach, that diverse opinions, diverse ideologies should be integrated and allowed their equal voice inside the debate. INBI and BIAN don't exist as an advocacy organization for a specific point of view. What they should be and are is a forum for interested debate by open-minded people. And that's what I would say. Those people who are interested in the subject, interested in the possibility of moving in that direction, should come and join, should participate. If they believe it, they should be active. Because in the end, it's up to the community of scholars and community of activists who are going to advance the cause. And the cause is, don't forget, social justice, freedom, greater equality, more security. Those things. And they're worthy things that surely unite us all. A good society requires all of those things. And anybody who doesn't think that, we don't really want. But anybody who believes those things and believes gender equality, believes ethnic equality, believes religious equality, and believes in democracy, join INBI.
Thank you very much, Guy. Thank you, friends, for watching this interview. And Guy has just completed another book which is going to be published by Penguin on a primer on basic income and an introduction to basic income. Let's look forward to that. And thank you so much, Guy.
Thanks.